Well, hi everyone, welcome to the Eclectic Producer. Well, this last couple of weeks have been really pretty interesting. There's been a lot going on, a lot of changes, a lot of frustrating things that have occurred, but overall there's a lot of progress being made. Uh, Finally, I'm able to print PETG that looks really, really nice. This hasn't even been cleaned up yet, so finally got things under control. However, getting to that point was really, really a challenge. Certainly much harder than I would have thought. So the first thing is the BLTouch issue. We got the BLTouch in. I ran my original test where I printed the outline of the one part just to see how it was going to do, and did that, or was going to do it 5 times in a row. So I did it 2 times. Things seem to be working. Remember, in this with the stock firmware, the BLTouch will go through and do the auto bed leveling every time. When it got to the 3rd time, suddenly I started getting these high and low spots in the first layer again. Nothing had changed other than just starting the print over, and I was very careful to remove that first layer, not moving anything, not touching anything. After running that test, it was clear that it wasn't the BLTouch, because the brand new BLTouch did exactly the same thing. So that really indicated that there was some sort of a firmware issue or something else going on with the process. So I decided to put working on that on hold for a little bit and go back to trying to get the PETG to print nicely. So one of the first things I tried to do is print temperature towers and retract tests and everything else. The temp towers had an effect. However, retraction didn't really have much of an effect at all. And one of the things that's unique with this Ender 6 is the original Bowden tube is about 0.85 meters in length. So it's really, really long. I had it running along with the normal cable harness. And so that really added to the length. And also it caused it to move quite a bit. So the first thing I tried to do was shorten the Bowden tube and ran it in a more direct route. It's still fairly long, but I took off about 300 millimeters or so, or about 6 inches. And that actually made quite an improvement. Not with the ups and downs, of course, that was something else, but with the overall printing quality of the PETG. So I was certainly on the right track. So I decided that it would be worthwhile to try a direct drive unit. I had tried to keep this project stock as long as I could, but it was clear that something needed to change. So I started researching for direct drive systems and found several that looked pretty good, but the Bondtech unit looked really interesting, and I liked the way it seemed to be a little bit smaller and a little bit more balanced. So I decided to order one, got it in, and in the process of waiting for it, I also upgraded the software or the firmware in this unit to what they recommended. Bondtech has their own version of the Ender 6 firmware that was created by Insanity Automation and Tiny Machines 3D, and Bondtech markets it, I guess you could say. So I decided to give that a try. And that requires both an update of the main firmware and also the LCD driver firmware. Updating the LCD was quite a challenge. I followed the procedures, or at least I thought I was following them, and had quite a difficult time. Nothing seemed to be working. It would go through and look like there were files possibly being updated, but the length of them was 0. And nothing was actually being transferred. It took me a long time of rereading everything to realize that one of the keys is using a small 8 gig micro SD card. And it has to be formatted with a block size of 4K bytes. I saw that mentioned in a couple of places, but I wasn't completely clear on if that was a requirement or if it was just a standard. It turns out it's a requirement. So doing a lot of scrounging, I finally came up with an older, smaller SD card, formatted it with all the right parameters, copied all the files over onto it, put it in, obviously had to take everything apart for the LCD display, and finally got the firmware to update for the LCD. The moral of the story there is making sure you have an 8 gig or smaller card so you can format it correctly to make it work in here. That was quite a challenge. On the main board, it seemed like a larger SD card would work fine. Although I did go ahead and use the the 8 gig one just to make sure everything was fine. After everything was loaded and started to run it, there was quite a few differences in how the display works, and a huge difference in how the BLTouch works. The way they do their initial adjustment and everything else is radically different. So with the new firmware, there's a number of different additions. Extra messages that pop up at different areas. Some views are very different. Some look exactly the same. If you go into tools, quite a few really good tools here. And that's the next thing that I started to do to verify everything was working right. There's a tool for resetting the BLTouch. If you recall, sometimes the BLTouch gets into that flashing mode. That'll stop it. You can also go in and change different display settings. There's quite a bit that they've added to this. The big change that they made that was really helpful for me in printing the PETG was having the PID tuning, so that I could actually control the temperature more accurately. And it's a fairly easy process. You can go in and just hit an automatic mode in here and set the temperatures you want it to go at, hit start, and it'll go off and automatically create the PID values. You can also go in and modify them on your own if you want to, but that's another issue altogether that I don't want to get into at the moment. But the automatics seem to do quite a good job. And so once I was able to do that, I noticed that the overall temperature control was quite a bit better. So even though this looks like it's a stringing issue, this was really more of a problem with the temperature not being consistent. So once I adjusted the PID, this was the result. Still a little bit of stringing, but not very much. And notice that even from the bottom all the way up, not much change. So obviously there was a temperature issue that was causing a lot of the stringing that I was seeing. So now when I go and print a regular part in PETG, there is really no stringing at all. It is really, really nice. Changing the firmware is a good idea. So once everything was working with the new firmware, went ahead and retried my test piece. The first layer worked really, really nicely. I printed 4 more variations of it, and they all looked exactly the same. None of the up and down issues. I don't want to go back to the original firmware again. Maybe I should, just to validate that that was the case, but whatever it is this new firmware is doing seemed to have removed that issue that I had. At the same time, I also replaced the build platform. If you recall, the other one was severely damaged when I went ahead and printed that one large part that had all the ups and downs in that first layer. So anyway, this has been quite a endeavor so far. So after getting the temperature set, going through and doing bed leveling, get everything right, I went and printed quite a large number of new parts. Other than some minor issues, like one small support piece falling over, all of the prints worked really well. I've never had so much success in a row as I had so far just by changing the firmware. And yes, I still have the new BLTouch in there. I don't think that made a difference, but I'll go back and try that again. Finally, the Bondtech unit arrived. This is the direct drive extruder. Very nice little assembly. Overall, the instructions seem to be pretty easy to follow. There was a nice video online. Started to install it and realized something wasn't quite right. Couldn't figure it out. I spent probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours, and I'm not exaggerating, trying to figure out how it needed to fit, what needed to move, was I doing something wrong? And it turns out that the back of this, and also the assembly on the side for holding the fan, is different than what they showed in the video that they have online. And so after I realized that there was a difference, I decided, okay, I better not try to install this before I do any more damage. I ended up calling MatterHackers, which is where I purchased this, and they only carried one version of this is the DDX extruder. And they didn't realize that there might be a different version. So I have an email into Bondtech seeing if there's a different version or if there's some different parts that I need for the back of this. Because the issue was interference between this back and the screws on the mounting plate. There's no way to actually get this to go flush to the back. It's kind of crooked and offset. And as I mentioned too, this fan mount doesn't seem to fit into the configuration quite right. Hopefully I'll hear from them in the next couple days, and I'll let you know how it goes. To wrap it all up, changing the firmware made a huge difference. Even if you don't have the Bondtech unit, you might want to consider just getting their firmware and giving it a try, because this really helped a lot for me. Once we get this direct drive unit in there, that might help as well, because I'm still getting some lines and some funny things happening with the PETG. And that filament that I'm using is fairly soft and flexible. And even if it gets just a little bit warm, it tends to get very, very soft. So trying to retract is really not doing much. So having a direct drive unit in there should help that quite a bit. Because I still get little blobs and things on some of the flatter surfaces. But overall, it's a huge improvement. So at least things are moving forward. And until next time, take care. Bye.